Mars, the red planet. For thousands of years, men have stared upon this large red dot, seemingly massive in the sea of tiny stars. Well before the concept of a planet existed, it would mystify, intrigue, and captivate many who would try to unravel its enigma. The Egyptians would name it Desher, or the Red One. The later Romans, Mars, their god of war. Forever elusive and featureless, many would speculate much things about the Red One. Did it have mountains? Did it have water? Did it have life? These thousands of years later, in the last half of the 20th century, the Martian surface would stay elusive no longer. Deep in the heart of the motherland, a new empire, known as the Soviet Union, would dare to challenge this god of war. Affixed to their super heavy Proton rocket was a weapon made to reach the heavens and touch a god. An automaton, a machine, a spacecraft. In this modern odyssey, the throne would not remain untouched. The Soviet Union and Mars 3 would prevail. First off, welcome. I'm Ben. So, for time's sake and my own sanity, we'll be covering just the history of Russian Martian exploration in this video. And I may be a tad bit more brief on explaining how each individual component works than I usually do. I have covered a lot of these in depth in other videos, so I'll just reference those when appropriate. Oh, and if you do end up liking my videos, make sure to do the whole like, subscribe thingy, as it really helps the channel get out there. Alright. With that out of the way, let's get into it. The first plans for Martian exploration missions in the USSR would start all the way back in 1959. It would be called Project 1M, and would be handled by none other than the famous OKB-1 Design Bureau, headed by one of the fathers of modern rocketry, Sergei Korolev. Just a quick personal note that the OKB-1 guys were absolute geniuses. They basically did it all. Lunar missions, Mars missions, the first slingshot maneuver, the list goes on. Even though I'm American, I have to give credit where credit is due, and if you're a person who researches this stuff, you'll know that the OKB-1 Bureau comes up a lot. Anyways, long story short, these guys were pretty insane. So Project 1M was pretty cool. It had your usual USSR stuff on it, particle detectors, micrometeorite counters, something called a spectrorefractometer, whatever that is, and of course your classic Soviet fluxgate magnetometer. While the 1M was amazing, its flights would see its third stage completely fumble it, putting it on the wrong trajectory towards Mars and just yeeting her off into the middle of nowhere. Fortunately though, the act of making and testing the spacecraft would give the OKB-1 Design Bureau vital and valuable knowledge. 3 years later, in 1961, Korolev and the boys would design the 2MV. It was basically the same as the 1M, but now not only would it be planned to fly by Venus as well as Mars, but would also feature this little Luna 9 type lander strapped on top of it. Now using this big ass 4-stage R7, the newly labeled Mars 1 would see some success after its 1962 launch. However, as with many early spacecraft projects back then, full success was elusive. While gathering much interplanetary data, a small gas leak in Mars 1's RCS system would see it failing before reaching the red planet. Before we move on, it should be of note that the Mars 1 spacecraft bus would also be the main basis for much of the early Venera missions, as, design-wise, you really couldn't go wrong with what's basically a giant armored fuel tank. Fast forwarding to 1965, with the manned lunar race heating up, and the OKB-1 Bureau being pressed to develop the massive N-1 rocket, Korolev himself would order that all planetary projects be transferred to the Scientific Production Association, or the Lavochkin Design Bureau. Sergei Korolev was personally reluctant of this at first, as it was his dream to fly to the other planets. In his first and last meeting with the Lavochkin engineers, he would tell them, quote, "I hand over to you my most prized and valuable possession, my dream. I expect you to work hard, but if my faith is not rewarded, I will do as Taurus Bulba once said, I give you life, and I'll take your life." Safe to say, the pressure was on. After some time dedicated to Venera, in 1969, the Lavochkin engineers would work on the next generation of Mars craft, the aptly named Project M69. Nice. This spacecraft would be leaps ahead of the more universal craft that came before it, and would be made specifically for a Martian mission. It would feature many upgrades such as a 4-tank fuel system from Luna 15, a new parachute system for its lander, and the addition of a little bitty Martian rover, something that would go on to become one of the staples of the Mars program. Disappointingly though, in testing, the original M69 design wasn't looking so hot. That whole Luna 15 fuel tank system was kinda garbage, and couldn't allow for unsettled engine restarts even after heavy modifications from the teams. To combat this glaring issue, the Lavochkin lead engineer, a certain Georgy N. Babakin, decided, as any competent engineer would do, to say hell nah and chuck that shit right in the bin. Him and the boys would design a way better craft from scratch, and would go on to become the M69 proper, or in other documentations, the M4 planetary spacecraft bus. It was designed for both Venus and Mars, and would become the basis for the Mars program going forward. Speaking of going forward, the Bureau teams only had 13 months until the planned launch date, so this whole process was getting pretty down to the wire. Somewhat miraculously though, the teams were able to get it done, on time and launching in March and April of 1969. Both craft would go up, and then both the Protons exploded and it came back down. Even with this heartbreaking setback, the Bureau teams were not deterred, for a once-in-a-15-year event would mark one of the last solid chances to launch a Mars mission. The Earth and the planet Mars would be on their closest approach in more than a decade, and with the craft being modified further, it would be labeled M71, and now we finally arrive, our boy, Mars 3. While Mars 2's descent module will go on to do a little whoopsie, the next mission, Mars 3, would on December 2nd of 1971 become the first spacecraft to safely land on the surface of Mars. It would operate on the surface for a mere 1 minute and 50 seconds before failing. But, you know what they say, 1 minute and 50 seconds is 1 minute and 50 seconds, and would still mark humanity's first transmission from anything that actually survived re-entry and impact. So now that we're caught up on the history of the Soviet Mars program, it's time, as always, to see what makes this incredible machine tick. Because I haven't covered it yet, we'll quickly go over the rocket or launch vehicle of the Mars program, the fancy new Proton K rocket. Being a 3-stage derivative of the original Proton, the Proton K6 Glushko-designed RD-253 engines would see its first stage generating a massive 2.3 million pounds of thrust at maximum power. All 3 stages would use a toxic nitrazine and nitrogen tetroxide combo, and would allow the Proton K to achieve a maximum payload capacity of over 21 tons to low Earth orbit. Where Mars 3 differed was the addition of its 4th stage, Block D. It would be the first Block D variant, one that was originally made for the 5th stage of the mighty, but kinda explodey N1 moon rocket. Its single-chamber OKB-1 designed RD-58 engine could generate 18,000 pounds of thrust at its peak, as well as having a burn time of over 10 minutes. Both the Proton and Block D are still around, having been upgraded many times, and are today some of the most reliable rocket systems in the world. Before moving on, there is one specific thing to mention about Mars 3's Block D systems. The majority of the navigation and command for Mars 2 and 3's Block D would have been done autonomously by the Mars orbiter itself, with the orbiter having quite an advanced data and computing system. We'll get into some of the details of that later in the video, but for now, it's time to talk design and construction. To start out, I first want to quickly mention that Mars 2 and 3 are both sister craft, and are exactly the same. So for this reason, that's why I'm just going to be referring to them as Mars 3, as it was the most successful mission out of the two. Secondly, as we get further into the Mars 3 systems, we'll be going over the big Chungus orbiter first, then get into the smaller and kinda more simple-ish lander, as there's a lot to go over with this beast of a thing. Also, a little disclaimer that some equipment was transferred over from the M69 to the M71, so some things might have been replaced, but I'll make sure to double check, and if I'm iffy about something, I'll add this little M69 note to it. Alright, now let's take this thing apart and see how it works. Being constructed mainly out of an aluminum alloy, the design of the M71's orbiter was basically a big old cylindrical fuel tank with everything just bolted and welded onto it. Genius. Altogether, the whole package would weigh in at over 5 tons, or 4,650 kilograms to be exact. The orbiter and lander, with fuel, would range from 7,500 pounds to 2,600 pounds respectively, with the dry weight of the lander coming down to a little under 800 pounds. The top of its frame would feature its new and improved lander, and this bottom sealed bubble of the craft would house many of the orbiter's instrument systems. Originally, it was planned that Mars 3 would rendezvous with an already waiting satellite, named the M71S. M71S would relay planet condition data and provide transmission to Earth for the Mars landers. As initially, the two other Mars orbiters were on a simple flyby trajectory, and would just pass on by after deploying their landers. As you can probably guess, something went wrong. But it wasn't mechanical this time. It was literally just some guy punching in a command wrong. Oof. Nevertheless, the teams had a bleeding edge and relatively untested backup in the form of the Space Automatic Positioning System. They just have to hope that it would work. We'll get into what I lovingly refer to as the SAPs later, but it's something to keep in mind. The rest of the M71's design would feature various thermal systems such as thermal blankets throughout the craft. Both the orbiter and the landing vehicle had their own separate radiators, with both systems using a silver solder that could withstand a temperature of up to 1,290 degrees Fahrenheit. Both were actively cooled using a non-liquid gas-based system, with the orbiter using these two massive radiators, and the lander's smaller one making up this distinct panel on the back of the lander's equipment ring. Both the orbiter and the lander would also use a vast array of nitrogen gas canisters combined with airbags to do various tasks such as fill up a gas bag to eject the lander's aeroshell cover, split open the parachute instrument cover, blow open this thermal cover for the lander's heat shield, and would also be used to cut its parachute as well. Yeah, lots of gas cartridges on this thing. One thing that surprisingly wasn't an airbag, though, was the lander's impact protection. The teams decided that 7.8 inches of plastic foam would be used to cushion the lander's hit with the ground. This choice, while seemingly small, would go on to be quite a wise decision, as more than 2 decades later, NASA's Pathfinder would still encounter problems with an impact bag type of system. There was also quite a few pyrotechnic devices on Mars 3. I won't go into every single one, but they'll be doing things your average spacecraft stuff would do. Undoing clamps, separating and ejecting the lander, that sort of thing. There was also one thing about them I found interesting though. On its lander's classic Luna-inspired 4 pedals were these things called pyro pushers, and would be used to completely open and lock the pedals in place shortly after its displacing bag had ejected its aeroshell. Pretty nifty. Mars 3's actual lander, the little egg-shaped looking thing, would also be called the Mars Automatic Station, but because we have reference photos and for time's sake, we'll just refer to it simply as the lander. So before moving on to the proper systems, there's part of me that can't leave out the design section without talking about this ridiculous testing contraption the teams dubbed the Catapult. It was used for testing the lander, and would literally just chuck this thing at like 180 Gs right into the wall and bounce it every which way. This would be done under simulated Martian conditions such as temperature, wind, and dust as well. It would also go on to survive this rigorous testing, proving that the plastic foam was indeed viable, and giving the engineers confidence they could get the job done. So there's not a whole bunch I could find about the M71's power systems, but we do have some references from the good old M69 data. It would presumably use the M69's massive 110 amp-hour rechargeable nickel-cadmium battery. It would be hermetically sealed, and, as with most spacecraft, most likely ran on 24 to 28 volts DC for its main power systems. However, we do know that because of Mars 3's advanced systems, the craft would feature quite a few voltage step-downs and regulators to feed its picky onboard computers. Moving on, we got these folding elephant ear looking solar panels. They would measure a total of 75 square feet, or 7 square meters. There is no data on how much power these panels produced, but knowing what we know today about early Soviet panel efficiency, we can do some of those quick maths to figure out a ballpark guess. The early Soviet solar cells on Mars 3 were pretty good, and had to be for going all the way to Mars. The best they had at the time frame was an average of around 10% efficiency. By getting out our big brains, we first start by taking the square area, 7 square meters. We can now then simply times this by our efficiency factor, 10 for 10% in our example, giving us 70. Once we have this number, we can then take Mars's standard solar irradiance power, an average of 586, and further multiply this into our equation, now giving us a grand total of 40,020. From here, it is actually pretty easy. We just divide all that shit by 100, and boom! We can now estimate that Mars 3, at the Mars planet itself, would be making, give or take, around 400 watts from its solar panels. Also, my apologies to my fellow not good at math people. Trust me, I didn't like figuring that out at all. But when we gotta know, am I right? As far as the lander is concerned, it did have its own battery that was kept charged by the orbiter, so we at least do know that it was rechargeable. However, amp-hour capacities and voltage numbers are still unknown. In addition, the lander would feature no solar panels itself, but was designed to survive the 24-hour Martian night, most likely operating in a low power state in between gathering and sending data. I think it would be safe to say that the lander's power system was fairly ample for the task. Alright, I think that's about all I got for the power systems on Mars 3. I wish I could find a little bit more on it, but hey, at least we all know photovoltaic wattage estimations now, right? Right? As I mentioned earlier, for the instruments on Mars 3, we'll start with the orbiter. Each M71 orbiter carried some 196 pounds of scientific equipment in its sealed, and some would say iconic, Soviet donut thingy towards the bottom of the vessel. It would house 2 of these outside the donut, so let's get those out of the way before we take a look inside the instrument package. The first of these would be this stereo antenna called the Spectrum 1 attached to the solar panel. It was a joint venture between France and the USSR to study solar radiation and solar outbursts while on the way to Mars, measuring at the frequency of 169 MHz. The second of these external instruments was a good old Soviet classic, the FluxGate magnetometer. I went into this in my Luna and Sputnik videos, but in short, this 2-rod or coil-like device would use an electrical current to measure magnetic fields. It would use the difference in this current flow that was imparted from the surrounding magnetic field to measure its readings. Just like a lot of early spacecraft, the magnetometer on Mars 3, and as many instruments as the bureaus could get away with, would use no data storage for their readings, and would be live streamed back to Earth to be graphed and recorded back home. Getting into the orbiter donut thing, it would use various shutters and plugs to reveal its instruments for readings, and we would see a total of 11 different instruments on board. The first 3 of these would be the visible, infrared, and ultraviolet photometers. Both the infrared as well as the ultraviolet photometers would be used to detect and measure oxygen, argon, and atomic hydrogen amounts, with the visible spectrum photometer being used to measure Martian reflectivity on the surface and atmosphere. These photometers, or photometers, would work just about the same way as a nightlight sensor or a TV's infrared receiver would today, but like a really fancy retro spacecraft one. Next up is that spectroreflectometer thingy I mentioned in the beginning. It's basically just a ye olde spectrometer, and would be used to determine the amount of water vapor, if any, was in the Martian atmosphere. I honestly have no idea how it works, but it's there, and it exists. For our fifth device, we come to the infrared radiometer, and it's just as wild. It would feature an 8 to 40 micron range and would be used to measure the temperature gradients on the Mars surface all the way down to negative 148 degrees Fahrenheit, or negative 100 degrees Celsius. Moving on through, we now have the orbiter's cosmic ray detector and the charged particle detector. Once again, I've went over both of these devices in depth in my Luna video, but long story short, you can basically view these devices as the spacecraft's Geiger counters, if you will. And while using different principles of operation than a true Geiger counter, they nevertheless did the same job. Eighth on the list is the radio telescope and radiometer combo. The radio telescope would work in the 0.3 to 0.6 micron visible range, and would be used to further gather reflectivity data. The real cool part was that radiometer. Using radio reflectivity of the surface at the 3.4 centimeter range, this instrument would be able to penetrate the ground, and could give temperature readings up to an impressive depth of 19 inches, or 50 centimeters. It could also measure the dielectric properties of the surface and the atmosphere to boot. As well as this, the Mars orbiter would also feature 8 small electrostatic plasma sensors used for measuring the solar wind. The final and best instrument on the orbiter, though, I have saved for last, and that was the orbiter's telephoto cameras. It would consist of 2 cameras, one with a wide-angle lens and another using a narrow angle, using 52 and 350mm focal lengths respectively. What's bonkers about these cameras was, just like Luna 3, it would use real photographic film to capture its images, basically having a whole automatic darkroom on board. After it would pull a whole 1-hour photo in space to get its topographic images, it would use a facsimile or fax-based system to relay it on down like it was some 1980s office document. It would include red, green, and blue light filters, and was even capable of visibly mapping Mars in ultraviolet. It could produce a 1000 by 1000 pixel image, and was even capable of ground resolutions approaching 10 meters, matching that of even early spy satellites such as Corona. It should also be of note that some of these systems, such as the cameras, would have some limited data storage capability. It was done through the revolutionary use of a form of magnetic tape storage, and while I sadly have no specs for this system, I can tell you that it was a thing, and that it was indeed cutting edge for its time. Not to forget about our good little buddy the Egg Lander. Excluding the rover, which we will cover towards the end of the video, the lander itself would hold about 35 pounds of scientific payload, and would feature 6 instruments on board. These would include a gamma-ray spectrometer, a mass spectrometer, an X-ray spectrometer, ground pressure and temperature sensors, as well as having atmospheric density and wind sensors. One little note about the ground sensor, it would be housed on one of the lander's pedals right here, and would flip itself open to take the readings. Inside and mounted to the lander's own donut, the parachute instrument module, would also house its own basic instruments for gathering Martian weather data on its way down as well. The main noteworthy lander instrument, as far as public prestige was concerned, was the lander's camera system. Well before the time of influencers strapping them to everything, the Mars 3's camera systems would feature a full 360-degree lens. It would house 2 panoramic cameras, with each capturing the full 360 degrees field of view. The system was mounted vertically inside the lander's frame, so it functioned more like a rotating periscope, scanning over the surface while being protected from the elements. It was capable of transmitting a whopping 500 by 6,000 pixel image to its orbiter, and would do so at an astonishing speed of 72,000 bits per second in 1971. I'll just let that sink in for a second. Getting onto the propulsion on Mars 3, and man, does this thing got nozzles everywhere. There's a rocket, it's just all got rockets. But fear not, faithful viewer, as in true retro rocket style, we'll go over them one by one, as it's really not as complex as it seems. Well, it kinda is, but you'll get a good grasp of it by the time we're done with them. First off, we'll start with the main orbiter engine, or braking engine, the KDU-414. As with many early spacecraft, it would use that good old hydrazine and nitric acid blend, and would produce roughly 300 to 400 pounds of thrust. It was 2-axis gimbaled, and would be primarily used for course corrections, and to slow down the massive Mars 3 when it would inject into its Martian orbit for station keeping and lander deployment. Second on the list is the orbiter stabilization system. Using the same toxic mixture as the main engine, these small yet powerful nozzles would be what would spin and despin the craft as it made its way in and out of deployment to the Red Planet. Both the main engine and the stabilization engines would also be pressurized via nitrogen through these little spherical tanks on the outside of the craft. Our third propulsion system would be the orbiter's cold gas jet system. This and all other cold gas jets on Mars 3, including the lander, would be nitrogen-based, with the orbiter's cold gas jet system being used for primary attitude and directional control. See, that wasn't so crazy, was it? Next up, Egg Lander. The Mars 3 lander is where the propulsion gets a little bit more going on with it. It would feature these things referred to as gunpowder rockets. Now, many of you, just like myself, are probably thinking about how there's one tiny issue with this situation. Normal gunpowder doesn't work in space. Nor does it even work on Mars for that matter. These so-called gunpowder rockets would be used to do such things as spinning and despinning the lander vehicle in a throttleable manner, slowing down the lander, and would provide finely tuned pitch and yaw adjustments. The only thing I could find in Mars 3's documentation was, other than being called gunpowder engines, the three things that were referenced would stick out with me. 1. These engines could be throttled. Okay, solid rocket motors could still do that. 2. They could be turned on and off. Alright, maybe cold gas jets are hypergolic then? Which brings us on to number 3. The whole nitrogen cold gas and solid rocket systems for the lander are clearly labeled, but they're also clearly separated and distinct from these gunpowdered rockets. The lander has no hypergolic tanks, nor is there any mention of one. So I had to know, what in the hell are these things? Just like in my Corona video, I would find myself going down a rabbit hole once again. I started by looking up the Soviet rocket engines. Nothing. I moved on to, God forbid, Google AI, to try to find just any potential answer or hint to this thing. That's when it dawned on me. To really figure this out, I would have to look up and go through every rocket system that was possible. While going through this hefty task, and almost giving up on it, I finally found it, the key info we needed. With the CO2-laden Martian atmosphere, it was possible to use powdered magnesium to react with this carbon dioxide. In fact, we do know that this is entirely possible, with Russian research and testing for these systems being carried out all the way back in the 60s. While the Martian atmosphere is thin, it consists of over 95% carbon dioxide. As well as this, having a somewhat pure, abundant, and low-pressure source of CO2 would make this type of engine pretty viable, albeit with a larger combustion chamber. And hey, what do you know? Those do look pretty big considering the size of this lander. With its orbiter already dipping into the atmosphere for deployment, and the weight saving it would provide, it is my best guess that Mars 3's gunpowdered rockets would indeed use this powdered magnesium. While this theory is scientifically and historically sound, we still don't know 100%. If there is anyone out there that was involved in Mars 3 who comes across this, please comment below as we would love to know. Off script Ben here, I gave some reasonings why these were magnesium engines, but I didn't really quite explain why they went away or why you don't see them on any other spacecraft. I got a few kind of explanations for that. One, the advancement of hydrazine systems got smaller, way better. My second would be the fact that the Soviets really went and sterilized this thing, sanitized the hell out of it. So one of my theories is that when Viking and all those other craft came after and started using hydrazine, they basically just gave up and were like, alright, this is too complicated, too much to do this. And yeah, let me know what you guys think about it. Alright, back to the video. With my long-winded explanation out of the way, before we move on to navigation, let's quickly cover the lander's injection rocket and the cold gas systems. The injection rocket was pretty simple. It was just your big old dumb solid rocket motor with a one-time use and no throttling capability. It would be used, as the name would suggest, to punch itself into the Martian atmosphere and inject itself into the planet. It's a perfect time to mention here that Mars 3 also used a ballistic trajectory and did not aerobrake as modern spacecraft do. So when it dipped into the Martian air, it came in fast. We'll get into the landing sequence later on, but trust me, it's pretty insane for 1971. Moving on to those gas jets, as I mentioned, they would be nitrogen-based, and would be stored in these two little balls right here. Make all the jokes you want with that one. From what I can tell, there was two sets of dual-sided cold gas thrusters on opposite ends of the lander's 4-tube frame, with the other ends being taken up by the gunpowder rockets. It would be used for fine attitude control and would even have its own dedicated ball as a form of redundant nitrogen supply. In addition to these previously mentioned systems, it should also be mentioned that there was also a few other smaller solid rocket motors on the Mars 3 lander. One would be this little rocket to get out the drogue, or auxiliary parachute, that was needed to initially slow the vehicle, which would deploy around Mach 3.5, by the way. Another would be these two sets that would be attached to the parachute and tucked in there with all of it. One set of these would provide deceleration thrust at the end of landing right before releasing the egg. After this, the next set would then activate, yeeting the parachute and the whole other half of the parachute instrument donut right into oblivion. Parts of both the navigation and communication sections of this video are going to be leaps ahead of what I went through in my previous videos, with maybe the exception of Surveyor, so forgive me if I don't go super in-depth into some of this stuff. Long story short, and to get this out of the way, the original navigation or control system for Mars 3 was solidly tested. Unfortunately though, it wasn't all that good. It was sorely lacking in capability, but this one guy, who I'm not even going to try to pronounce, was like, hey bro, I got this really good yet kinda untested system that's gonna be way better. After some debate, and some unheard of compliances from his bureau, it would be chosen over the old and outdated analog system. You heard that right, with this bad boy, we're going full digital. The main orbiter system weighed around 368 pounds, and would in fact actually save on launch weight by taking out some of the Block D's 4-stage automatic control system. The control system, in which part of it would be the SAPS, or Space Automatic Positioning System, and whose system was derived from the final stage of the N1 moon rocket, would be all extremely advanced, using transistor and early integrated base circuit technology, as well as using a software concept known as PVM, or Parallel Virtual Machine. Using a Parallel Virtual Machine system on Mars 3 would allow it, its lander, and all of its equipment to have true two-way data communication and processing capability. So not only could it parallel process as the name suggests, but all of its onboard computing systems, including the lander, would be combined to provide on-the-fly multi-system workload management. Now I dearly wish that I had data processing figures for this, but to keep this brief, it simply cannot be understated just how impressive this system is. Altogether, it would consume 800 watts in full operation, and when making my Surveyor video, I was in awe when learning about its automatic soft landing. And while yes, that was in 1966, the advancement in these 5 years after it would be nothing short of incredible, and these other systems would have nothing on Mars 3, or future spacecraft for that matter. Before moving on, I just want to drive home the fact that, other than the ground command sent to start its mission from an Earth parking orbit, this control system would allow Mars 3 to transit, inject, land, and orbitally insert its orbiter into Martian orbit completely autonomously and with no human intervention whatsoever. Even with this advanced control system, it would still need some astronomical references, or the eyes of the spacecraft, if you will. The trip to Mars was going to be a long one, and Mars 3 couldn't afford to get lost, hence why it was equipped with a bunch of light sensors. Most would be located in this external pod right here. It would feature 2 redundant fixed sun sensors, 2 actively controlled precise sun sensors, 2 star sensors using the star Canopus, 1 Earth sensor, and 1 Mars sensor. I've covered all of these in my other videos, but basically all of these sensors use a lens and a 4 photocell type sensor, sometimes more, to detect drift in a focused beam of light. When the beam of light drifts away from the center, this could be measured and the direction of this drift to then be known. One other feature to note about the M71's orbiter navigation was that it would also use a full 3-axis gyro-based stabilization system. I don't think I need to go too far into that one, but it exists, and it had one. Alright, now that's about it for the orbiter. Now let's get into the lander. Navigation for the lander was pretty straightforward. It would feature its own digital automatic control system and would feature no gyroscopes, using its braking cone, rockets, and gas jet systems for stabilization. Unlike Surveyor's little radar disc thingy, for a 3-point reference in space, the lander would see itself using its own orbiter to help with navigation calculations. Once it had got told it was close enough to the ground, the Mars 3 lander would navigate by activating its 2 radar altimeters. Due to weight constrictions, it would be decided to forego a better Doppler-based system for this. It would use 1 high-altitude radar and 1 for low altitudes, with the low-altitude radar commanding its final landing tasks. A little thing to note about the radars was that, with the heat shield, aka the braking cone on, the high-altitude radar altimeter would use this little bitty little thingy antenna that would spring out and pop out the side of the braking cone. Shortly after the braking cone was separated, the high-altitude radar was turned off, and the low-altitude radar switched on. Just as with the rest of the craft, the digital navigation and control of the lander would also allow for some pretty impressive error correcting and correction calculation limits, and would honestly just stomp any analog system that came before it. Even with this though, all of it would be useless without sending data back to Earth, which brings us around to the next section of the video. Mars 3's communication. So both the orbiter and lander's communication systems were pretty wild for what time frame this was. Just like the navigation, they would be digitally based, being fed data through both digital and analog components. The first of these to be featured would be the various low-gain antenna systems used for the orbiter's radio telemetry system. They would consist of these directional antennas fitted to the solar panels, as well as these weird-looking omnidirectional cone ones. They would run on a frequency of between 790 to 928 MHz, and would use 500 separate data channels to relay the multitude of science and sensor data back home. The low-gain telemetry system would run on an average of 100 watts, and was capable of transmitting data at a respectable speed of 128 bits per second. Moving on to the high-gain system, the one used for sending data like photos back to Earth, we would see this massive 9.1 foot wide parabolic antenna. It would operate at the 6 GHz frequency range, was capable of an astonishing antenna output power of roughly 25 kilowatts, and could send data back to Earth at around 6,000 bits per second. It would also store this data en route through its orbit via its magnetic tape storage system, gathering data from its lander and later stabilizing its high-gain antenna for broadcast. Again, this was done fully autonomously. As well as this, the orbiter's digital communication system would also make use of real-time, on-the-fly data compression when beaming signals back to Earth. Moving on to the lander communication, as mentioned with its cameras, the Mars 3 lander could communicate and send data to its orbiter at around 72,000 bits per second. This would be done using 2 separate data channels for its two-way communication, being capable of adding to the Mars 3's total processing ability even while detached from its orbiter and on the ground. You know what? Speaking of being on the ground, before we check out this craft's special feature, I think it's about time we go over that landing sequence, shall we? At just over some 28,000 miles above the Martian surface, Mars 3 and its lander would aim and correct for a ballistic inbound trajectory. With pyro pins, they fire, separating the landing vehicle from its orbital mothership. Drifting slowly downwards for 15 minutes, its solid rocket injection motor springs to life, imparting a delta V of over 120 meters per second and punching straight into the Martian atmosphere. Another 2.5 minutes later, and hurtling at over 3.6 miles per second, its command system would now angle the craft into the moving Martian airstream. At a measured 2 Gs of accelerometer input, its gunpowder engines would kick in to force its stabilization. Later, and now being stabilized through the aerodynamics of its braking cone alone, the lander's onboard computing systems analyze and wait for its G-forces to curve downwards. And now, on the major command of T1, Mars 3's main landing sequence is initiated. Still traveling well in excess of Mach 4, with a massive spark and a plume of smoke, its drogue chute would deploy. Now slowing to a speed of Mach 3.5, the expansive gas cartridge and the drogue detachment system is ignited, detaching its parachute instrument cover, deploying the main parachute, and blasting away its now useless drogue. Mere seconds later, devices known as pyro knives slice through the main parachute reef. With a jolt to the spacecraft and puffs from the reaction system, the parachute unfurls. Now slowed to just 150 miles per hour, Mars 3's computer systems command T4 and T6, and the high-altitude radar system warms as its braking cone violently ejects. So much to come so far. Victory is close. At a range of 50 to 100 feet above the surface, the high-altitude radar would send the command request to its PVM. The low-altitude radar is powered on, and the landing engines are started. Time to make history. Now traveling at only 12 miles per hour, the low-altitude radar sends its command. Pyro pins holding the egg-like lander to its frame are ignited. In the storm of dust, with a final outburst of flames and noise as its landing system is tossed aside, Mars 3 and the planet itself fall silent. "15 seconds later, as the dust settles, a slow hiss resonates from the alien craft. With a pop and a bang, its displacing bag sheds the aeroshell. After this, another bang, as the pyro pushers lock Mars 3 into place. The spacecraft was down, and history made. The first successful soft landing on Mars would be the Soviets' prize. However, with Mars 3 on the ground and its body stabilized, the Soviet Union would attempt to do one better than just simply land on Mars. They wanted to explore. Lowered onto the surface via a robotic arm would be a radical machine, an exploration vehicle, a rover, and its name was Prop M. So Prop M is by a long shot the most objectively dope thing that stands out about Mars 3. The second any space fan sees images or videos of this thing, it sticks with you. And why wouldn't it? It is literally a crazy two-legged hopping Mars rover from the goddamn 1970s. And that, my friends, is cool as hell. In fact, it was really cool. We'll find out soon that the Prop M rover was much more than meets the eye. Weighing in at a pretty light 9.9 pounds, or 4.5 kilograms, the Prop M rover would see it measuring around 6 inches wide, 8 inches long, and having a height of around 2.3 inches at the top of its drive motor. After being deployed by a 6-point robotic arm, it would feature 2 experiments on board, one being a densiometer to check density, and the next being do I have to really say this? A penetrometer further measuring ground properties. It would stop and take readings every 4.9 feet using a 49-foot or 15-meter long power tether. However, there's just one twist with the power cable. This wasn't just your run-of-the-mill average Joe power cable. For you see, just like the rest of Mars 3, this was a data cable. Using these sensing bars, so to say, Prop M could not only avoid obstacles by moving its legs in opposite directions after it bumped into something, but using its data cable, it could, wait for it, actively map and navigate the terrain using straight-up algorithmic navigation logic. It is honestly just absolutely insane to me that this little basic derpy-looking waddling thing is at the same time smartly and properly navigating using the lander's onboard PVM computers. It is really now, after covering Prop M, that we truly and fully understand just how significant and important Mars 3 is to spacecraft technology. So the last few noteworthy mentions about Mars 3, the ones that didn't really quite fit into the video sections, were firstly, as I shortly mentioned off script, the Soviets would go through some lengths to make sure that Mars 3 was as clean as possible. Each individual component and instrument would be sterilized using a combination of methyl bromide, radiation, and thermal heating. Because these forms of sterilization cannot be used with the fully assembled spacecraft, seen here in this footage, a new and larger cleanroom facility would be constructed for Mars 3, and would use a pressure difference system in combination with some of those cool as hell old school UV lamps. It should also be noted that there was a lot of legendary Soviet space program names involved in this project. Korolev, Demikin, Glushko, Fedchenko, the list goes on. Contrary to our humorous Western stereotyping, i.e. if they mess up, send them on over to the Gulag, these leaders and their teams would actually go on to hold extremely high prestige. And while work was hard and deadlines were set, the government of the USSR nevertheless held these men in the highest regard. While the lander on Mars 3 would fall silent some 110 seconds after touchdown, only sending back this 20 seconds of photographic data, it would still undoubtedly mark the very first time any spacecraft has survived the sheer speed, violence, and hell that is Martian re-entry. For that alone, it and every brilliant mind who's worked on it deserves a hats off with the utmost respect. Even with its lander failing, the still operational orbiter of Mars 3 would go on to gather so much data on the Martian atmosphere and terrain that it's honestly too long to mention. Reluctantly giving the throne of Martian photos to the later US Viking missions, the next set of Mars missions would unfortunately be hampered by what I call the transistor plague of 73. However, after this, a more daring mission, dubbed Project 5NM, would take its place. With it, the Soviets wouldn't be coming to just touch a god anymore. They were planning to take some of the god itself. But that, my friends, is a story for another time. Until then, Mars would remain waiting. Even after the coming of Viking and Project 5NM, the Red One would still have to wait 26 long years to see another machine move under its own power across its surface, finally ending that wait with the coming of NASA's Sojourner rover in the year of 1997. Before closing, I just want to give a massive credit to V.G. Pernimov, the lead designer for Mars and Venus spacecraft at the Lavochkin Design Bureau. His 1999 book, The Difficult Road to Mars, was an irreplaceable resource. It is extremely rare to have this much info about an early Soviet spacecraft not only survive the fall of the USSR, but to also be so up to date and in English. It has so much more humor and amazing stories than I could ever cram into this video. One quick one being the team's hotel windows, and all the other windows for that matter being absolutely wrecked by the N1's second launch explosion. So if you're a fan of Mars 3 and have the time, it is definitely a great read, and I put a link in the video description. Plus it's also like 90 pages, so it's not like too long, you know what I mean? Well, I think that's all I have for Mars 3, guys. And to wrap this thing on up, I believe it's time that I bid you all farewell. Even if I do this all myself, I'll never ask for your money. But if you would like to support me, just do the whole like and sub mumbo jumbo to help others get into the love of spacecraft. With that, as always, I'm Ben, this is Retro Rockets, and I hope you Have an amazing day.